They were buried before sunrise. No names carved into the wood, no prayers spoken over their graves. Just two small coffins, identical in size, lowered into the damp Kentucky soil, while the mist still clung to the ground like something alive, something watching. The men who carried them refused to speak, and the priest who had baptized half the town stood at a distance, clutching his crucifix so tightly that his knuckles turned pale because whatever those twins were, they were not meant to be remembered. Nearly 50 years earlier, long before the official records of their deaths, whispers had already begun. To understand what happened in 1834, we must go back far beyond the polished stories told in American textbooks. Back to a harsher, quieter time, a time when the frontier was still wild, when the lines between faith and fear blurred easily, and when the unseen was not dismissed, but feared. Colonial America in the late 1700s was not just a place of expansion, it was a place of tension. Religious authority was absolute in many settlements. Ministers and preachers held not only spiritual influence, but social control. Communities were tight, insular, and deeply suspicious of anything unfamiliar. The memory of events like the Salem witch trials still lingered in cultural consciousness, shaping how people responded to the unexplained. And in the western frontier regions, particularly in what would later become Kentucky, life was even more uncertain. These lands, still contested and only loosely governed, were home to settlers who brought with them rigid belief systems, fear of the unknown, and an unshakable conviction that God and the devil walked among them. It was here in a remote settlement just beyond the established counties that the story begins. Her name was Eleanor Whitlock. To her neighbors, she was a quiet woman, devout, reserved, the kind of person who attended every sermon, never missed a Sabbath, and spoke only when necessary. But there were things about Eleanor that unsettled people. She had arrived in the settlement without family, no husband, no clear past, only a letter of introduction from a minister in Virginia long, deceased by the time anyone thought to verify it. Still, in a place where survival depended on cooperation, questions were often buried beneath necessity. Eleanor was given a small plot of land near the edge of the settlement. She kept to herself, worked hard, prayed often, and for a time, nothing seemed unusual, till the winter of 1783. That year, the cold came early. By November, frost had already settled into the soil. Crops failed, livestock weakened, and the settlement, like many others in the frontier, began to feel the creeping anxiety of scarcity. It was during this winter that Eleanor's condition became impossible to ignore. She was pregnant. For a woman with no husband, this alone was enough to stir quiet judgment. But what truly disturbed the community was not the pregnancy itself. It was the way it progressed. Eleanor's belly grew at an unnatural rate. Within weeks, she appeared as though she were near full term. By mid-December, she could barely walk. The local midwife, a woman named Abigail Turner, was called to examine her. What Abigail reported afterward would never be written in official records. But fragments of her account survived, passed down through letters, journals, and oral histories. She described the movement within Eleanor's womb as violent, unnatural, not the gentle shifting of a child, but something else, something coordinated. By the time the labor began, the entire settlement was aware and afraid. Eleanor refused to give birth inside her home. Instead, she insisted on being taken to the small wooden chapel at the center of the community. This alone was unusual. Birth was considered a private matter, not something to be brought into a sacred space. But Eleanor was adamant. She claimed, according to Abigail, that it must happen before God. No one dared refuse her. The night of the birth was described as unusually still. No wind, no animals. Not even the distant sounds of the forest that typically echoed through the valley. Inside the chapel, only a handful of people were present. Abigail Turner, 2 elderly women from the congregation, and the minister Reverend Samuel Hale, a man known for his unwavering faith and his absolute intolerance for anything he considered unholy. What happened next would fracture the settlement in ways that could never be repaired. Eleanor's labor was long, agonizing, and wrong. Witnesses later described her screams as inhuman, not because of their intensity, but because of their tone. There was something layered beneath them, something that did not belong to a single voice. As the hours passed, the tension inside the chapel grew unbearable. Reverend Hale began reciting scripture aloud, his voice rising with urgency. The elderly women clutched their rosaries, whispering prayers under their breath. And Abigail tried to focus on her work, to do what she had done dozens of times before, but nothing about this was familiar. The first child was born just after midnight, a boy. Small, pale, silent. For a moment, there was relief, till the second child began to emerge. Twins were not unheard of, but what followed was something no one present could explain. The second child was born facing the first. Not physically attached, but positioned in such a way that the moment it entered the world, its eyes opened and locked onto its brother. Neither child cried, neither moved. They simply stared at each other, unblinking, unresponsive to touch, to sound, to light. It was as if they were not aware of anything else in the world, only each other. Reverend Hale was the first to speak, and what he said would echo through every retelling of this story. They are not meant to be separate. What happened in the hours that followed remains clear. Accounts differ. Some claim the children began to move in perfect synchronization, mirroring each other's breathing, each subtle twitch. Others insist they spoke, not words, but sounds. Low, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Abigail Turner would later write in her private journal, "I have delivered many children. I have seen life begin in all its forms, but never have I witnessed something that felt so entirely devoid of God. By morning, the chapel was sealed. No one was allowed inside." Eleanor Whitlock was not seen again for several days, and when she finally emerged, she was alone. The official explanation was simple. Twins had been stillborn, buried quietly, in accordance with local customs. No further discussion was permitted. Reverend Hale delivered a sermon the following Sunday condemning idle curiosity and warning of the dangers of questioning God's will. Most people accepted this, or at least pretended to. Because in small communities, survival often depends not on truth, but on silence. But silence has a way of breaking, especially when the truth refuses to stay buried. Over the next few weeks, strange reports began to surface. Livestock behaving erratically, dogs refusing to go near the chapel, children claiming they could hear whispers at night coming from beneath the ground. At first, these stories were dismissed. Fear, after all, was common in harsh winters. But then, Abigail Turner disappeared. Her home was found empty. No signs of struggle, no indication of where she had gone. Only one thing remained: her journal. What was written inside would never be shared publicly. But fragments carefully copied, passed in secret, suggest that Abigail had begun to question the official story. She believed the twins had not been stillborn. She believed they had been something else. Something that the church and perhaps others had chosen to hide. And then, nearly 50 years later, in 1834, the graves were opened. Why? That is where our story truly begins. Because whatever was discovered that day was enough to ensure that the twins would be buried again. This time, without names, without records, without history. Who were they? What were they? And why did even the earliest attempts at scientific understanding fail to explain them? You're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If this story unsettled you, you're only beginning to understand its depth. Take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this are not just history, they are warnings. Tell me this: if something defies both faith and science, do we study it? Or do we bury it and pray it never rises again? In Part 2, we will uncover what was found inside those graves in 1834, and why the men who witnessed it refused to speak for the rest of their lives. Because some truths are not forgotten, they are hidden, and sometimes they are waiting. The graves were not meant to be opened. It's not in 1834, not ever. By the time the men arrived at the burial site, Kentucky was no longer the fragile frontier it had once been. It had become a state, structured, governed, watched. The wilderness had receded, replaced by expanding settlements, trade routes, and the slow machinery of American progress. But beneath that progress, something older remained, unrecorded, unresolved. The reopening of the graves was not an act of curiosity. It was an order. It's quietly issued. It's carefully worded. and deliberately concealed from public record. The man responsible for carrying out that order was Dr. Elias Mercer, physician by training, a rationalist by belief, and a man who had built his reputation on dismissing superstition wherever he found it. Mercer had studied in Philadelphia, where the early foundations of American medical science were being shaped. He believed in anatomy, in reason, in the idea that every mystery, no matter how unsettling, could be understood through observation and evidence. That belief had served him well, until now. He had been summoned to the settlement under vague pretenses, a request for medical consultation, a matter of historical irregularity, nothing more. But when he arrived, he immediately sensed the tension. The town was older than most in the region. Its buildings, though repaired and expanded over the decades, still carried the architectural fingerprints of the late 18th century. Timber-framed houses, narrow windows, low ceilings designed to conserve heat during brutal winters. At its center stood the chapel, rebuilt once, but not entirely changed. Mercer noticed it immediately, not because of its size or structure, but because of its position. Unlike most colonial chapels, which were carefully aligned east to west, symbolizing resurrection and divine order, this one was slightly off, barely noticeable, but intentional. Its foundation had been shifted, not by accident, by design. When Mercer asked about it, no one gave him a direct answer. They spoke, instead of renovations, structural necessity, of weather damage from years long past, but their explanations lacked conviction. In communities like this, silence was rarely empty. It was protective. Mercer was not the only outsider present. There were others, men who did not belong to the town, men who spoke little and observed everything. One of them, a government clerk named Thomas Avery, carried with him a collection of documents, old records, letters, fragments of journals, some official, most not. It was Avery who first mentioned the twins. Not directly, but through implication. "There are inconsistencies in the burial records," he said. His voice was measured, careful. The documentation from 1783 does not align with later accounts. Mercer had encountered such discrepancies before. Clerical errors, lost records, the natural decay of historical accuracy over time. But something about Avery's tone suggested this was different. That night, Mercer was given access to the documents, not all of them. Only a selection, enough to guide him, but not enough to explain everything. The earliest record was a church ledger, dated December 1783. Under normal circumstances, such ledgers were meticulous. Births, deaths, marriages, each carefully recorded, often with notes regarding legitimacy, cause of death, or spiritual standing. But this entry was incomplete. 2 infants, it read. No names, no cause of death, no parental acknowledgement, only a symbol drawn beside the entry. A crude mark, almost like a circle, split down the middle. Mercer studied it for a long time. It was not a standard notation, not something recognized in medical or ecclesiastical documentation. When he asked Avery about it, the clerk hesitated and handed him another document. A letter, unsigned, undated, but clearly written in the late 18th century. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as if the author had been under distress. "They are not separate," the letter read. "The Reverend insists they must not be allowed to remain. He says it is a test, or a punishment. I do not believe him. I have seen them. They do not behave as children should." The letter ended abruptly. No conclusion, no explanation. Mercer felt something shift, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. Over the next several days, more fragments emerged. A portion of Abigail Turner's journal, damaged, incomplete, but legible enough to raise questions. "I am watched," she wrote. "Not by the townspeople, by them." Another entry, written days later. "They do not sleep, not as we do. They become still. And yet something within them continues. I cannot explain it. I do not think I am meant to." Mercer read the entries repeatedly, searching for patterns, for rational explanations, for anything that could ground the words in reality. But the deeper he looked, the more the boundaries of reason began to blur. The town itself seemed to resist inquiry. Conversations ended abruptly when he entered rooms. Eyes lingered too long. Doors were closed more often than opened. Even the chapel, ostensibly a place of worship, felt guarded. Mercer requested access. He was denied. Not directly, not officially. Flexion. Until finally, one evening, Avery approached him in private. "There is something you need to see," he said. They entered the chapel after dark. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The interior was simple. Wooden pews, a modest pulpit, faint traces of older construction beneath newer repairs. But it was the floor that drew Mercer's attention. Near the altar, the wood was different, newer, and beneath it, something had been altered. Avery knelt and pried loose a single plank. What lay beneath was not part of the original structure. It was a cavity, shallow, deliberate, and inside it, a second layer of flooring, older, marked. Symbols had been carved into the wood. Not decorative, not artistic, but precise. Repetitive, the same circle, split down the middle, again and again. Mercer felt his pulse quicken. "This was not part of the original design," he said. Avery nodded. "It was added after what?" Avery did not answer. Instead, he handed Mercer one final document, a sealed report, never submitted, never filed. It bore the name of Reverend Samuel Hale. Mercer hesitated before opening it. Something about the weight of the moment felt irreversible, but he opened it anyway. The contents were unlike anything he had expected. Hale's writing was controlled, measured, but beneath it, something strained. "They are bound," he wrote, "not by flesh, but by something deeper. I have prayed for understanding, but none has come, only silence." Another line, "They must not be allowed to grow." Mercer stopped reading. The implications settled slowly. "They lived," he said. Avery met his gaze. Yes, the silence that followed was heavy. Everything Mercer believed, everything he had built. His understanding of the world upon began to fracture. If the twins had lived, then the burial records were false. If the burial records were false, then what had been buried in 1783? And more importantly, what had been done to them before they were hidden away? The next morning, the order was given. The graves would be opened, not publicly, not ceremonially, but in secrecy. Only a handful of men would be present: Mercer, Avery, and two others whose names were never recorded. They arrived before dawn. The earth was damp, heavy, reluctant to yield.
Us.
The first shovelful of soil was removed. Mercer felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, but anticipation. Because whatever lay beneath that ground was not just a medical anomaly. It was a secret, one that had been buried for 50 years. Protected, hidden, feared, and now it was about to be uncovered. The first coffin was reached just as the sky began to lighten. It was smaller than expected, crude, unmarked. Mercer knelt beside it, his hands steady, his mind racing. Pried it open, and what he saw inside made him forget how to breathe. Because the body within was not alone, and it had never been. The body inside the coffin had not decayed the way it should have. It had endured. Dr. Elias's Mercer did not step back. Not immediately, because his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The child's form was small, preserved beyond reason. The skin, though pale and tightened with age, had not collapsed inward as expected. It clung to the bones with unnatural integrity, but it wasn't the preservation that unsettled him. It was the shape. There was only one body, but two spinal structures. Mercer leaned closer, his breath shallow. The ribs split, divided as though something had once existed alongside it, and then been forced away. "Where's the second coffin?" he asked. No one answered. Avery stood behind him, silent. The other men avoided looking directly into the grave. "Where's the second coffin?" Mercer repeated. One of the men finally spoke. There was only ever one marked location. That was impossible. Mercer had seen the records. 2 infants, 2 burials, and yet only one body remained. A cold realization began to form, not fully understood, but deeply wrong. "Dig further," Mercer said. The men hesitated, only for a moment. But Mercer noticed. They did not want to continue. Still the digging resumed, slower now, more cautious. Each shovelful of earth seemed heavier than the last. Minutes passed, then more. Nothing, no second coffin, no remains. No explanation. But then the sound changed. A dull, hollow strike. The shovel had hit something. Not wood, not bone, something else. Mercer dropped to his knees, brushing away the soil with his hands. What emerged was not a coffin. It was stone, flat, carved, hidden beneath the original burial. A second layer. Avery stepped forward. This wasn't documented. Of course it wasn't, because this had never been meant to be found. The stone was lifted slowly, carefully, and beneath it, a space, not large, but deliberate. Inside, wrapped in what remained of decayed cloth, was something smaller. Mercer reached in. His hands trembled now. For the first time, he unwrapped the cloth and found bones, but not arranged as they should be. They were fragmented, not broken, separated, as if they'd been taken apart. Carefully, methodically, and then placed here. A second burial, without a coffin, without dignity, without record. Mercer stared at them, trying to understand, trying to impose logic where none seemed to exist. Two bodies, once connected, then separated, so one preserved, the other dismantled. "Why?" he whispered. No one answered, but someone was listening. Mercer felt it before he saw it, a presence. At the edge of the clearing, he turned sharply. There was nothing there, only trees and mist. The feeling remained. They were not alone. That night, Mercer could not sleep. The images replayed relentlessly. The divided ribs, the hidden chamber, the second set of bones. But it wasn't just what he had seen. It was what he couldn't explain, and what someone clearly didn't want him to. He lit a candle and returned to the documents, reading them again. Slower this time, more carefully, looking for something he had missed, and then he found it. A pattern, the symbol, divided circle. It appeared in more than just the ledger. It was in the margins of Abigail Turner's journal. Faint, repeated, not decoration, not coincidence. A code. Mercer began cross-referencing the entries, dates, symbols, fragments of text, and slowly a message began to emerge. Not written in full sentences, but in pieces. They are aware. Separation weakens them. Observation must remain constant. Mercer's breath caught. Observation that implied something still existed, something still capable of being watched. But the twins were dead, weren't they? A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. Mercer froze. Another knock, sharper this time. He stood slowly, moved toward the door, opened it. No one, just the cold night air, and something on the ground. A piece of paper. Folded, he picked it up, unfolded it. 3 words. Stop digging now. No signature, no mark. But the handwriting, it matched the journal. Abigail Turner. Mercer stepped back, his mind racing. That was impossible. She had disappeared decades ago. No, it didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. The next morning, Avery was gone. No explanation, no farewell. His documents remained, but he was gone. Mercer searched the town, asked questions, received none. People avoided him now. Openly, doors closed as he approached. Conversations ended mid-sentence. The silence had changed. It was no longer protective. It was hostile. That afternoon, Mercer returned to the chapel. This time, no one stopped him, which was more unsettling than resistance. Inside, the air felt heavier. He moved toward the altar. To the hidden compartment, it was already open, the carved symbols exposed, and something new. Fresh markings, drawn recently. The same divided circle, but altered. A line drawn through both halves. Mercer stared at it. A modification, a warning, or a progression. Behind him, the floor creaked. He turned. A figure stood at the far end of the chapel, still silent, watching. "Who are you?" Mercer asked. No response. The figure stepped forward, slowly revealing an older man, dressed plainly, but with a posture of authority. "Wondered when you would see it," the man said. His voice was calm, measured. "You shouldn't be here," Mercer straightened. I've already seen enough to know that's not true. The man studied him. You've seen fragments, he said, not the whole. Then show me. A pause. Then no. The words settled heavily. Some things, the man continued, were buried for a reason. Mercer stepped closer. And some things were hidden because they shouldn't have been done. The man's expression did not change. You think this is about truth? He said. It is. No, the man replied. It's about containment. The word echoed. Containment. As if they weren't discussing something that had ended. Something ongoing. Mercer felt it again. That creeping realization. This isn't over, he said. The man did not deny it. Instead, he said something far worse. It never was. Silence filled the space between them. Then a sound. Faint beneath the floor. Mercer's head snapped downward. There it was again. A soft, rhythmic tapping, not random, deliberate. The same pattern. Back and forth, like something trying to communicate, something trying to get out. Mercer looked up. The man was already watching him. You hear it now, he said quietly. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, more precise. And then it stopped. Completely. The silence that followed was unbearable, because Mercer understood something in that moment. Something that changed everything. The graves had not been the end. They had been the beginning, and whatever had been separated was no longer content to remain that way. The man turned toward the altar. There's something you haven't seen yet, he said. Mercer hesitated, only for a second, then followed. Because whatever lay beneath this place was about to reveal itself. And this time, there would be no burial. The sound beneath the chapel floor had stopped, but its echo lingered. Dr. Elias Mercer did not move. Not immediately, because something had shifted not in the room but within him. Until now, everything had been observation, evidence, fragments waiting to be assembled into reason. But this was no longer a puzzle. It was a confrontation. The older man near the altar remained still, watching Mercer not with hostility, but with a kind of measured patience, as if he had seen this moment before. You've crossed the threshold, the man said quietly. Mercer didn't respond. His focus was no longer on the man. It was on the floor. That rhythmic tapping, too precise to be natural. It's deliberate to be ignored. Who are you? Mercer asked again. This time the man answered, My name is Jonathan Hale. The name settled heavily. Hale, the same name that had appeared in the sealed report. Reverend Samuel Hale, your father, Mercer said. Jonathan nodded once, and his burden, silence followed, not empty, but waited. Because in that moment, the past and present aligned. The authority that had once buried the truth was standing here again, not as a relic, but as a continuation. Mercer straightened. You knew, he said. Jonathan did not deny it. I inherited knowledge, he replied, not choice. That distinction mattered, because it revealed something important. Jonathan Hale was not simply an antagonist, he was a custodian. And custodians do not create secrets, they preserve them. Interval, the story pauses here. Not in action, but in understanding. Because to move forward, we must understand the players, not just what they do, but why they do it. Dr. Elias Mercer, a man of reason, formed in the early institutions of American science. Educated in a world that was beginning to reject superstition. His strength is clarity, his ability to observe without fear, to dissect the unknown and reduce it to knowledge. But that strength carries a weakness. Mercer does not believe in limits. He assumes that everything can be understood, everything can be explained, and that belief has brought him here. Because what he is facing is not simply unknown, it may be unknowable. His moral conflict is no longer intellectual, it is existential. If something exists beyond explanation, does he accept it or destroy it trying to understand? Jonathan Hale, a man shaped by inheritance, not wealth, not status, but responsibility. Raised in the shadow of a father who believed he had encountered something beyond God's design. Samuel Hale did not record everything, but what he did record was enough. Enough to convince his son that the world contained fractures, places where natural law did not apply. Jonathan does not seek power. He seeks control, containment. His belief system is simple. Some things are not meant to exist freely, not because they are evil, but because they are incompatible with the world around them. And when such things appear, they must be contained, no matter the cost. His justification is not cruelty. It is necessity, because he has seen what happens when control is lost. Thomas Avery, the missing clerk, a man caught between duty and doubt. He was sent to document, to verify, to ensure that history aligned with record. But what he found did not align. Avery's loyalty was never to the town, nor to Mercer. It was to truth, and that made him dangerous, because truth, in this place, is a threat. Abigail Turner, the unseen witness, the woman who saw too much, understood too little, and paid the price. Her journal reveals fear, did also defiance. She did not accept what she was told, and that refusal changed everything. Because Abigail did not disappear, she was removed. The town, a collective character, bound by shared knowledge and shared silence. Their loyalty is not to individuals, but to survival. They know something is wrong. They have always known, but fear has shaped their response. Because when faced with something beyond understanding, people do not seek answers, they seek safety. And safety here has always meant obedience. End of interval. The tension does not break, it tightens. Mercer looked at Jonathan Hale, not as an obstacle, but as a man. "You're hiding something," Mercer said. Jonathan's expression did not change. "I'm preventing something," he replied. "That sound," Mercer said, pointing to the floor. "It's not memory. It's not echo. It's happening now." Jonathan said nothing, which was answer enough. "They're not dead," Mercer said. A pause. "Then, no," Jonathan replied. "They're not." The words settled like a verdict. Everything Mercer had believed until this moment fractured completely. The graves, the bodies, the separation. None of it had ended anything. It had only delayed it. "How?" Mercer asked. Jonathan turned slightly, looking toward the altar. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "Then give me the right one." Jonathan met his gaze. "Why are they still here?" That question lingered, because it implied intention, not accident. Mercer's mind raced. "Something is sustaining them," he said. Jonathan nodded once. "Guess what?" Jonathan stepped toward the altar. "Come and see." Mercer hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was the point of no return, because whatever lay beneath that chapel would not fit within the boundaries of science. But he stepped forward anyway, because not knowing was no longer an option. Jonathan knelt beside the altered floor, placed his hand against the wood. "There are structures beneath this building," he said, "older than the chapel itself." Mercer frowned. "That's not possible." "It is," Jonathan replied. "They were not built for worship." The words carried weight, because in colonial America, structures beneath churches were not uncommon. Storage, burial chambers, hidden passageways. But this felt different. Jonathan began removing the planks, one by one. The opening widened, and beneath it, darkness, not empty, not still, alive. Mercer felt it immediately. Pressure. Subtle, but undeniable, as if the air itself resisted. "What is this?" he asked. Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he said something far more unsettling. "My father believed they were connected to it." Mercer's pulse quickened. "Connected how?" Jonathan finally looked at him. "As conduits," the word echoed. "Conduits, not victims, not anomalies. Interfaces. Between what?" The tapping sound returned. Louder now, closer. Not beneath the grave. Beneath the chapel. Directly below them, Mercer stepped back instinctively. But Jonathan did not move. "They've been trying to reach each other," he said. Each other. Mercer's mind snapped back to the grave. The divided body, the separated bones. "They were split," Mercer said. "Yes, and now? They're trying to become whole again. The implications were staggering, because, if that was true, then the separation had not been a solution. It had been a delay, and delays eventually end. The tapping became faster, more urgent, almost desperate. Mercer felt something shift inside him. Not fear, resolve, because for the first time he understood his role, not as an observer, but as a decision-maker. "You've been containing this for 50 years, Mercer said. Jonathan nodded. "And it's failing." A pause. "Then yes." Silence filled the chapel. Heavy, absolute, because the truth had finally surfaced. This was not a mystery. It was a crisis. And it had been growing, for decades. Mercer looked down into the darkness beneath the floor. Whatever force was waiting, watching, trying. And in that moment, he made a decision. Not as a scientist, not as an outsider, but as a man standing at the edge of something irreversible. "We open it," Mercer said. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what you're asking." "I understand enough," Mercer replied. "It's trying to become whole. Then we need to see what that means." Jonathan stepped forward. "And if seeing it is what allows it to happen?" A pause. "The kind that defines outcomes." Mercer did not hesitate. "Then we stop it." The words settled, not as hope, but as intention. And beneath them, the tapping stopped, as if something had heard, and was waiting. The decision spread faster than the truth. By morning, the town knew something was happening. Not what, not why, but enough to feel it. In places like this, tension didn't need explanation. It moved through people quietly, in glances, unfinished sentences, doors that closed just a little too quickly. Dr. Elias Mercer stepped outside the chapel into a town that no longer felt neutral. Eyes followed him now, not with curiosity, but with accusation, because word had reached them. The graves had been opened, and that alone was enough to disturb the fragile balance that had held for decades. A bell rang from the chapel tower, not for prayer, for gathering. Jonathan Hale had called them. By midday, the entire settlement stood before the chapel. Men, women, children, all drawn by something deeper than instruction. Fear. Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, watching, listening. The air felt heavy, charged, because this was not just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Jonathan Hale stepped forward, calm, composed, but not untouched. For the first time Mercer saw it, not doubt, strain. 50 years of containment had not left Jonathan unchanged. "My father once stood where I stand," Jonathan began. His voice carried, not loud, but controlled. "He told this town that obedience would protect you." A pause. And it did. Murmurs moved through the crowd, because everyone understood what he was saying. Protection had come at a cost, and no one had ever questioned it until now. "The graves had been disturbed," Jonathan continued. The words landed like a strike. Gasps, whispers, movement. "You were told they contained death." Another pause. "They did not." The crowd shifted. "You're no longer hidden," because the truth was beginning to surface. And not all at once, but enough to break the silence. Mercer stepped forward. This was his moment, not to observe, but to confront. "They were never buried as they should have been," Mercer said. The crowd turned toward him, an outsider, speaking into something they had lived with for generations. "There were two bodies," he continued. "One preserved. One dismantled." A ripple of shock moved through the people, because some of them had always suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Jonathan did not interrupt. He let Mercer speak, because this was no longer about control. It was about exposure. "They were separated," Mercer said. "Why?" Someone shouted. The question cut through the air. Simple, direct, and impossible to answer without consequence. Mercer looked at Jonathan. This was his truth to reveal. Jonathan stepped forward. "They were not meant to exist as they did," he said. A woman in the crowd shook her head. "They were children." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said. "They were something else." Silence followed, because deep down, they had always known. Strange births, unnatural behavior. Whispers passed through generations. The story had never fully died. It had only been buried. They were connected, Jonathan continued, not by flesh alone, by something we did not understand. Mercer watched the crowd carefully. Fear was turning into something else. Division. Because belief does not disappear when truth arrives, it fractures. They were separated to stop it, Jonathan said. Stop what? Another voice called. Jonathan hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything shifted. Stop them from becoming something we could not contain. The words hung in the air, because now the truth was no longer hidden. It was shared. And shared truth cannot be controlled. The crowd began to turn. Not on Mercer, not on Jonathan, but on each other. Because the question was no longer what happened. It was what happens now. They opened the graves, someone said. They disturbed it. They brought it back. The accusations began to spread, not organized, but instinctive. Fear always seeks a target, and Mercer felt it shift toward him. You shouldn't have come here, a man said. Mercer held his ground. This was already here, he replied. But you made it worse. The words landed harder than expected because there was truth in them. Not all consequences come from action. Some come from exposure, and exposure has a cost. Jonathan raised his hand. The crowd quieted. Not completely, but enough. There is more, he said. The words cut through the noise. Because they carried weight. More meant deeper. More meant worse. The structure beneath this chapel, Jonathan continued, ripple of unease, because everyone knew, or at least suspected. There is something beneath us, he said. Now, the fear became tangible. Children moved closer to their parents. Men shifted their stance. Women whispered prayers. It has always been there, Jonathan said, and the twins. He paused, because this was the point of no return. You were connected to it. The silence that followed was absolute, because this was no longer about history. This was about now, about what lay beneath their feet, and whether it was still there. Mercer stepped forward again. We've heard it, he said. The crowd turned sharply. What? Someone asked. A sound, Mercer said. From beneath the chapel, the tension snapped, because now it was real. Not story, not rumor. Experience, you're lying, someone said. But the doubt in their voice betrayed them, because fear recognizes truth. Jonathan did not deny it. It's active, he said. The word spread through the crowd like fire. Active, not dead, not gone. Active. The consequences became immediate. People began to argue. Some demanded the chapel be burned. Others insisted it be sealed. Some wanted to leave the town entirely. Just when fear becomes collective, it becomes unstable. And unstable communities do not think. They react. This is bigger than one decision, Mercer said. But no one was listening, because the situation had outgrown reason. It had become survival. Jonathan stepped down from the front, moved toward Mercer. They can't handle this, he said quietly. Mercer didn't respond, because he knew. Truth does not unite people, divides them. And this truth was tearing the town apart. A child's voice broke through the chaos. Do you hear that? Everything stopped. Not gradually, instantly, because everyone heard it. At the same time, sound faint, but unmistakable. Beneath the ground, tapping, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. The same pattern Mercer had heard, echoing beneath the entire town. Not just the chapel, everywhere. The realization spread like a shockwave. It wasn't contained. It had never been contained. The ground beneath them was not silent. It was listening, and now it was responding. A woman screamed, not from panic, from recognition, because she had heard it before, years ago, as a child, and she had been told to forget. But memory does not disappear. It waits. The tapping grew louder, faster, more urgent. It's like something trying to break through. The crowd began to panic. People moved, shouted, prayed, but there was nowhere to go, because whatever this was, it was beneath all of them. Jonathan looked at Mercer, and for the first time, there was no control left in his expression. Only realization. It didn't separate them, he said. Mercer's breath caught. What? Jonathan's voice dropped. It didn't stop it. The words hit harder than anything before, because they rewrote everything. Yes. The burial. The separation. The years of containment. None of it had worked. It had only hidden the truth. Mercer felt the ground beneath his feet vibrate, subtle but real. "They're not trying to reconnect," Jonathan said. The tapping became frantic, violent. "They already have." The ground cracked. It's not wide, not visible to all, but enough. Enough for Mercer to see it. Running outward from the chapel, spreading like something beneath was moving, and in that moment, everything changed. Because this was no longer about uncovering the past, it was about surviving what had been awakened. And for the first time, Mercer understood something he had refused to accept. This was never a mystery to solve. It was a force to contain, and it was no longer contained. The ground did not split open all at once. It resisted, as if whatever lay beneath had learned patience. The thin fracture that spread from the chapel floor did not widen into chaos, moved slowly, deliberately, like something choosing where to emerge. The town stood frozen, not because they didn't want to run, but because they no longer knew where safety existed. Dr. Elias Mercer felt the vibration beneath his feet deepen. Not violent, not explosive, but steady, measured, like a heartbeat. Jonathan Hale stepped forward, closer to the chapel, closer to the center of it. "This is what he feared," Jonathan said. Mercer didn't need to ask who. Samuel Hale, the man who had first seen it, first tried to contain it and failed. "What is it?" Mercer asked. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Because some truths take time to speak, even when they are already understood. "It isn't them," Jonathan said. The words landed with quiet force. Mercer frowned. "The twins were never the origin," Jonathan finished. The realization unfolded slowly. The twins had not been the cause. They had been the symptom, the connection, the bridge, between something beneath the earth and something that had taken form above it. The tapping beneath the ground changed. It was no longer chaotic. It became synchronized, two rhythms, separate, but aligned. Mercer's breath caught. "They're communicating," he said. Jonathan nodded. They always were. The crowd began to retreat. Slowly, instinctively, because even without understanding, they felt it. This was not something that could be reasoned with. This was something that had waited for decades, and now it was awake. The chapel floor cracked again. This time the sound was louder, sharper. A section of wood splintered inward. Darkness beneath it shifted, not empty, moving. Mercer stepped closer, against instinct, against fear, because he needed to see, not to understand, but to witness. "What happens if we do nothing?" Mercer asked. Jonathan's answer was immediate. "It finishes," a pause. "And if we intervene," Jonathan looked at him, "it adapts." There it was, the truth neither of them wanted. There was no victory here, only outcomes, and none of them clean. The ground beneath the town pulsed again. Cracks spread further, branching, reaching, like veins beneath skin. A child began to cry, not loudly, but enough. Because innocence recognizes danger before it understands it. Mercer turned, looked at the people, families, children, lives built on land that had never been stable, and in that moment, his role became clear, not as a scientist, not as a seeker of truth, but as a man responsible for consequence. "We can't let it surface," Mercer said. Jonathan didn't argue, because for the first time, they were aligned. Not in belief, but in necessity. "How?" Mercer asked. Jonathan's gaze shifted to the chapel. "How?" To where it began. The implication was immediate. The structure beneath the chapel. The place where the connection had been strongest, where the twins had been brought, where something had recognized them and reached back. They moved quickly, not in panic, but with urgency sharpened by understanding. The crowd watched, not interfering, not questioning, because something had changed. The need for answers had been replaced by the need for survival. Inside the chapel, the air felt different, thicker, heavier. The opening in the floor seemed wider now, not physically, but perceptually, as if it was aware of them. Mercer knelt beside it, looked down, for the first time. Saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Movement. Not solid, not defined, but present, like shadow reacting to light. "What is that?" Mercer whispered. Jonathan's voice was steady, It's what connected to them. The tapping stopped, completely. The silence that followed was absolute, because now he was aware of them, watching, waiting. Mercer felt something shift in his chest, not fear, finality, because he understood something now. This was not something that could be destroyed, only interrupted, contained. Again, for how long? Mercer asked. Jonathan didn't answer, because the truth was already known. Not forever. Never forever. Mercer stood. There's only one place it can be closed, he said. Jonathan nodded. The connection point. The altar. Where the twins had been born into the world, where the boundary had first been broken. They moved together, not as allies, but as participants in the same inevitable act. The ground trembled again, stronger this time. Structure groaned, wood strained. Time was running out. Mercer reached the altar, placed his hands against it. It felt warm, alive, as if something beneath it was breathing. Jonathan stepped beside him. My father sealed it once, he said, and it failed. Mercer looked at him. Then we don't seal it the same way. A pause. Because this was the difference. Jonathan had preserved. Mercer would change. What are you suggesting? Jonathan asked. Mercer's voice was quiet. We don't contain it. Another tremor, stronger. We sever it. The word carried weight, because severing is not preservation. It is destruction. Whatever connects it to this place, we break it. Jonathan hesitated, because breaking something unknown carries its own consequences. And if that releases it, he asked. Mercer met his gaze. Then we make sure it has nowhere to go. The plan was not perfect, but it was decisive. Decisiveness was all they had left. The structure beneath them shifted violently. The opening in the floor widened. Darkness surged upward. Not fully, but enough to feel its presence. Mercer didn't hesitate. He struck the altar. Once, twice. Wood cracked. The sound beneath them reacted instantly. Sharp, piercing rhythm. Faster, angrier. Jonathan joined him. Together, they broke the structure. Not carefully, but completely, because precision no longer mattered. Only outcome. The altar split, collapsed inward. And the moment it did, the sound stopped. Not gradually, instantly. The ground stilled. The air lightened.
How the pressure lifted?
As if something had been cut off. Disconnected. The silence that followed was not empty. It was final. Mercer stepped back, breathing hard, waiting for something. Anything, but nothing came. Jonathan looked into the darkness beneath the broken floor, and for the first time, he allowed himself to speak the truth. Gone. Mercer didn't respond, because he knew better. Nothing like that simply disappears. It retreats. It waits. Outside, the town stood in silence. The ground no longer moved. The cracks no longer spread. Life. It's been returned but not restored. It's because something had changed. Not just beneath the earth, but within the people. The chapel was never rebuilt. The land was abandoned. Quietly, without record, without explanation. Families moved. Settlements shifted. And over time, the story faded. Not completely, but enough. Years later, a new structure was built over the site. Not a chapel, not a place of worship, but something simpler, a foundation. Covered, stabilized, ignored, because history has a way of hiding what it cannot explain. Dr. Elias Mercer never wrote about what he saw. It's not in full, only fragments. Carefully worded, ambiguous, as if even he was uncertain where truth ended and something else began. Jonathan Hale remained for a time, until he, too, disappeared from record. Not with drama, but with silence. The same silence that had always protected the truth. But one question remained, unanswered, unrecorded. The second body, one that had been separated, the one that had been dismantled. Its bones had been found. Yes, but something had been missing. Something small. Something never accounted for. And in all the records that followed, no one ever explained why or where it had gone. Perhaps it was nothing, a simple oversight, a fragment lost to time. Or perhaps it was never meant to be found. Because not all connections are visible. Some remain hidden, waiting for the moment they are needed again. History remembers events, but it rarely remembers what was prevented, what was stopped before it could become something worse. And in that absence, we build narratives of faith, of control, power. But beneath those narratives, there are fractures, places where truth was altered, where decisions were made not for understanding, but for survival. This was never just a story about two children. It was a story about what happens when belief meets the unknown. When authority chooses silence over truth, when power decides what the world is allowed to see, and when ordinary people are left to live above something they were never meant to know. The ground is quiet now. The structure is gone. The connection is broken. But history has taught us one thing. What is buried is not always gone. Sometimes it is only waiting. Waiting for the moment when silence fails again. You've been watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. And now, the question remains. What do you believe was truly buried beneath those foundations?